Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3, or the bottom of page 1323. Aleph Shin Chav Gimel. And the last paragraph that we learned yesterday, Rabbi explained the difference between the two forms of sweetening the severities or sweetening the gvuras, both coming from chesed, or the transforming of darkness, both coming from light, oir. And adarabah, the second one, the second form of sweetening, even though that the gvura itself gets transformed, not just subdued or neutralized. That, like he said, the gvura mishapach be'etzem mahusa v'acheshech nepach la'er mamish. That the gvura gets transformed in its core personality, and the darkness gets transformed to er mamish. Yet it's coming from chesed, and adrab, on the contrary, there you need even more chesed. They're the primary, because in the first approach, the first type, there's also the cooperation, so to speak, the engagement with, like he said, the hisaskus, the engagement, hislapshus, hisarvus of the gvura itself is also being trained and agreeing. In the case of Avodah, the animal soul is going along and also appreciating the value of the oir, of the nefesh alikis, of the divine soul and loving God and so on. Which is why it's called a birur mamata lamayla, from the bottom up. So even though it's also coming from chesed and from oir, or in the language of Kabbalah, from Shayma, which is being mavarish Shamban, but there, the primary work is in the ban, is in the birur of the animal soul, or the birur of the gvura, or the birur of the cheshach. That's what you're refining. Whereas when it comes to the second type of sweetening, there, it's true, it's transforming, but it's coming mamayla lamata, from the top down, not from the bottom up. And there the birur is primarily shema, as he called it. A birur whom the ma. And he said, even though it's in a higher way, because it's not coming through engagement and not coming through battle, milchama, is coming memela, yet it's really a power from above and not something that's coming at all from within the gvura, which is different than the first approach. So even though the first approach, again, it's driven by the chesed and the oir and the shema and the divine soul, but it engages more. Then he qualified and said that also in the second, there's also an engagement, for example, Teresh Shabal Peh, that's involved in Gashmizdika thing and arguments of truth and false. He gave the example of the Masoyis, the journeys in the wilderness. So they had to deal with Nechoshim v'Akravim, dangerous creatures and a treacherous journey. However, the Aron automatically killed and straightened out the path, paved the way for them. So there is some isaskus, but it's still mamayla lamata, and it's still a force that is automatically eliminating the negative. Whereas in the first eifun of Amtokas HaGvuras, that's not the case. There is an engagement. In the example, it would be like mixing sweet water with bitter water. But the ikar birur of Shema, which is the second birur, the second approach, is shalei b'derech hisaskus klal. And he gave the example for that at the time of the Beis Hamikdash, Shleima Melech, that the birur, well, first in general, the Beis Hamikdash, the birur was b'derech b'melech through Shema, and it was in the form of his hapcha, like we see by Shleima, that the nations, what he said here was, the words were, Shoyikulim nechnoim u'b'telim alav. Everybody was subjugated and nullified to him, or committed to him. So here the main primary force is therefore the imkain who I'm talking about, even more than the first approach, even though the first sweetening also is oir, is refining the darkness, but in the second it's primarily that. And then he explained what this means exactly. And he explained that there's two ways you transform darkness. You can transform darkness that the oir is so powerful that it replaces the darkness. The words that he used, he says like this. So the air is so powerful that literally zaps away the darkness, and the darkness itself becomes like light. But it's not that the darkness on its own became light, it's the air that completely transformed it. And the second is that the cheshach on its own. That's not the case here. Like I explained in the first sweetening of the severity, the first type, there's an engagement with the gvura. It's also not coming only from the gvura, it's coming from the nefesh halikis, but the nefesh habam is cooperating and is appreciating also on its own, it's valuing the ur. So the cheshach is appreciating the ur. The darkness is appreciating the ur. In the second, we don't even consider what the darkness has to say. It's the ur is so powerful that it transforms. It's from the top down. The third approach, which we're going to learn about, is when the darkness itself is transformed from within, not from the top down, from the bottom up. He used the words, so even though the ur is transforming the darkness, it's still called ur. In other words, the value here is ur, but the darkness has become like light. Interesting expression, but not the light of the darkness itself. It's the light of light, and then there's the light how it's even more powerful as it transforms darkness, which is greater. He says, bavadai, that when the cheshach becomes ur, it's greater than the ur on its own, but it's still the level of ur. But it's how cheshach became ur. Yeah. And the dogma for this was Matan Torah. This was the last thing we learned. What's the example for this Matan Torah? What happened by Matan Torah? She says, by Yered Hashem, godliness, God came down on the mountain to the point that it transformed the mountain, Oshan. Oshan Kule. It's completely covered in Oshan, in a cloud, in smoke. That means that the Kedusha permeated it, because God came down in a fire and you couldn't come close to it. So temporarily, that's what happened to the mountain. But this was not because the mountain fundamentally changed. Afterwards, all this passed on. Matan Torah did not transform the location where it happened. Not like the Beis Hamikdash, for example, where on the Temple Mount, even now when the Beis Hamikdash is destroyed, you're not allowed to walk on the Temple Mount. Kedusha le'zazim imkema. So he doesn't bring this here, but I'm just driving the point home. Or the Mishkan was also like Har Sinai. The Mishkan, wherever they traveled in the wilderness, the Mishkan was a holy place. There was Holy of Holies. You were not allowed to enter. But today, it didn't change the space, the location when they traveled through the wilderness. So same thing with Har Sinai. At the time, like he said, Lefishah, he used that word, Lefishah. Where is it here? That which was below was exactly like above, but that's the ur overpowering the cheshach and transforming it. And the same thing was regarding the effect of Matan Torah. That's the effect on the mountain and so on. Same thing by Matan Torah, the dvarim gashmim, the physical, it transformed physicality that through the mitzvahs that were given dafke begashmis, that till Matan Torah, the Aveda was in the spiritual level. That when the Oves, our patriarchs, they fulfilled the Torah, it was all beruchnis. And the Dvarim Gashmi, the physical matters, the physical affairs of this world remained cheshach. And Moshe Rabbeinu drew down the earth so deeply down that the cheshach, meaning the mata itself, the physicality of the universe, that itself. And he gives the example, the cloth of tefillin, the parchment of tefillin, the wool of tzitzis, the esrig, all became mamish, rotzna elyon mamish. So not just a spiritual experience, but the spirituality permeated the physical. And that means that the air comes in the place of the cheshech and causes the cheshech to become air. Then finally, he brought karbonis, the chenuba karbonis, that when you magdish behema, when you sanctify an animal and dedicate it to kedusha, this animal becomes kodesh, and its meat that will remain afterwards, after its offering, also is kodesh. And then said, Yesa dugmal is an even more accurate or a closer example, is when the kohanim eat the carbon, and that causes that the owners who brought the carbon are forgiven. So the achila is achila of Shayma. Remember, Shayma is mevar Shamban. Ban is behema. That's higher than the achilas mizbeach, which is Shamban, which is mizbeach, the altar. The fires of the altar also consumed the animal, but that consumption is the beer of ban. Now we're talking about the beer from ma. That's the kahanim eating it. That's why I think he said Yesu dugma lezeh, because not just you made the animal this, you also have the example. It's that the animal is being mekudesh, and when they're eating it, it's like shema being mevar shemban, because shemban is only bitla hayesh, like he said before. It affects the animal soul, but it doesn't transform it. So it's only the expression of the animal soul. Achilas Sodom is nichol shema datzilas, like bitl b'mitzias. And then he finally says this was also the achila, the meals, the eating of tzaddikim, and the meals of Shabbos, where the physical food itself is elevated to a spiritual state. But all this is the oyer, kol zel shaydei er nas acheshech b'chinas er mamash. That through the oyer, the cheshech itself, in this case, the cheshech is referring to the gashmis of this world, the physicality of the world that on its own is dark. What means dark? Concealed, that the divine is concealed, like we learned on page, when he began on page 1307, I believe, yeah. So the darkness of the world is concealed, and before Matan Torah, they were only able to bring spiritual light into the world, but not that the world itself was transformed. Matan Torah changed that. So Matan Torah on its own is essentially the second level of Amtokas HaGvuras, where you're sweetening the Gvura with a higher level of Chesed, a very high level of Oyer, to the point that it transforms the darkness. Now it's interesting that Matan Torah on Gashmias, the Har Sinai was a temporary thing. When it comes to Matan Torah, we say from after Matan Torah, we have the power forever to transform the physical world into a spiritual, to spiritualize the material, which is basically making everything into a Chefza Shel Kedusha. The Asid Lava in the future will be revealed. So Matan Torah gives us the power to do it, but on its own, Matan Torah is still Mamayla Lamata. It's a force from above that is so powerful that it literally permeates and transforms the physical reality to godliness. But then comes the hard work of continuing to do that until we come to the third level, which we'll talk about, as I said, in another 2 pages. So meanwhile, this is the second knife. Okay, that's a summary of what we learned yesterday, which I thought worthwhile reviewing. I'll stop if anybody wants me to ask any questions, and then I'll give an introduction to the next paragraph, what he's going to do now to further explain this idea. Any questions? Okay. So the next paragraph requires an introduction, and it takes us back a few things to volume 1 of Ayin Beis. Now, this may jog some of your memories because we're going back at least 6 years, maybe more. I remember when we were up to that place, maybe 7 years even. So it takes us back to volume 1. And also, you may recall that the ideas we're going to learn now were also mentioned. I'm just saying it for the record, and I'll explain the connection a little later. It's mentioned on page 1272. So we're now on 1323. But it needs an introduction because it's a little Kabbalistic and somewhat cryptic on its own. So let me put it into context here. you see introduced the concept of Shayma and Shamban. So Shema ban are expressions very commonly used in Kabbalah for sure, but in Chassidus as well. As in a way, ma and ban is very broadly, it's somewhat like oir and choshech, but it's also odom and behema, and it's the mevarer and the mizbarer, the one that's doing the refining and the one that's being refined. So like when he brings the example of a carbon is from a behemoth. You bring an animal. An animal also includes the animal soul. Odom kiyakiv mekem carbon lashem, the Alter Rebbe interprets. Odom kiyakiv mekem. Should have said Odom mekem kiyakiv, because you're being makriv your animal soul as well. So all that goes in the category of ban. Shema, on the other hand, is the mevarer, is the force that is doing the refining. In the worlds, ma and ban are often referred to toyu and tikkun. So tikkun, the shema of Atzilus, of tikkun, is repairing the ban, the behema, and the powerful energies of toyu that were too powerful and caused the containers to shatter. Basically, an imbalanced and a chaotic world. And tikkun, the ma, is mevarer. There's even in the Haggadah of Pesach, when it says before the Manishtana, so it says kan haben shoyel ma. So in the Haggadah of Chabad, you'll see that the interpretation kan haban shoyel man. Haben can also be read as haban. Ben is the child that the child asks ma, which is Manishtana. But if you think of it, it's also kan shoyel haben is borrowing and drawing down from ma. The ma referring to the Manishtana, ma referring to Shema. You'll find ma ban very central in many, many places. As a matter of fact, if you're familiar with the classic sikha of the Rebbe, Chayesara Tovshinun Beis, this was the last sikha till today that the Rebbe spoke to the Kinus HaShluchim, to the Shluchim conference, the year 1990, it was 1991, but it was already Tovshinun Beis, 5752. Chayesara, which was when the Kinus would begin. So there is a big part of the Sikha. He talks about Yitzchak and Rivka, which was part of the parsha of from Chayesara, the story of Yitzchak and Rivka getting married and meeting each other. That Chassidus calls it the Yichud of Ma and Ban, and that is the central foundation to all of Yiddishkeit. The Rebbe brings that is that the Ma and the Ban joined together, essentially the birur of existence, like he's explaining here. So that's one thing that we have to just put into place. And if you go back a few pages, right here, with the Ma and Ban, I referred to it yesterday, on page 1318, he also made it a very, you see, it's quite a fundamental piece, where he says the whole Torah is chesed and gvura, is the amtokis hagvuras through Sodim. He said, the God with his right arm gave us the fiery law, which is gvura, to his people. So he brought the Imin Hashem Remema, and then he brought the tikkun. Zeh kol inyan hatikun betagberes achsodim d'shema al b'chinas hagvuras d'shem ban. I'm reading on page 1318, like around 10 pages, 10 lines from the top. More like 12 lines from the top. You'll see in a moment why I'm referring to all of this, because I want to bring it all back to where he's going to go now in the next paragraph. So he says clearly, Tagberes achsodim d'shem ma. So he's associating ma with chesed over the gvuras of Shem ban, which makes sense. The behema is much more powerful than a human being, but the human being is the wiser one, is the one that has more bittul. The behema doesn't have bittul. The behema follows its own whims, its own impulses, I should say. Just like the difference between the Adam, gematria ma, and ma's bittul. Ma comes from the word ba, like ma and bittul, nochnu ma, koyach ma, what? And ban is yesh. So it's the beginning of Guru the Shem ban. And then he continues and says clearly again and again repeats again, because I'm talking about that today, Ma is higher than Shamban, just like the Oyer is higher than the Keli, or the Or is higher than the Cheshach. The Chesed dominates over Gvura. But La'asid Lave, he says, Gvura will rise. In other words, there'll be something that Shamban is even more powerful than Shema. But right now, we're talking about the birur of ban through ma. The difference between the two types of sweetening of Gvura is, like he explained on the top of 1323, is the focus on ban. The birur b'derech mamata l'mayla is only the ha'ora, the reflection of Shema. Birur the ban, the focus is on the birur of the animal soul, of the behemoth. And l'mayla lamata is the birur of ma, the focus is on the ma, on the oir. In a way, you could say weekdays. We learned this earlier in volume 2, that the weekdays, which is lechem min ha'aretz, the bread from the earth, is more like birur of Shem ban. The bread comes from the earth, it's from the bottom up. We eat it, we have to digest it, there's waste. It's a real birur of ban. Shabbos, when we eat on Shabbos, like he said at the end of the paragraph, there it's a birur of eichel metechel. There ma is dominating. There we're not supposed to be working. In the weekdays, you work hard, and through uvdin dechel, the weekday mundane work, we bring godliness into it. So ma is being mevarer ban. Shabbos is much more focused on the ma, that there's so much gili air, it automatically elevates the food that we eat. But when do you prepare the food? Misha targh erev Shabbos. The one who toils erev Shabbos, yechol b'Shabbos. So Shabbos is more the achila, like he said, the achila of Shem, of the Adam, Shema, and the weekdays would be more the birur of ban. Okay, that's one introduction. That's just to put things into context. The next one is, and this takes us back to volume 1. In volume 1, you may remember, if not, I'll refresh your memory. He was talking there about the interface between the divine and existence, that the interface is chochmas tima. In general, the interface in the language of the Arizal is keser, because keser on one hand has atik. Atik represents tachteina shebe ein sof, like we learned. Atik is more reflective of the ein sof. It's removed from existence, and that's why it actually has the power to create the transformation of the gvura, because it's coming from cheser of kshet, cheser of atik. And then there's arech ampin, a lower level in keser, that relates to reish hanatzolim. It's not yet the emanations of Chachma Bina Das, but it's the head of them. It's the beginning of them. It's the leader. It's the lower part of Keser. So Keser serves as an interface. Atik represents, so to speak, more like the bottom of the top, and Arich is the top of the bottom. And that's where they meet. There in Ayin Beis, he, however, asked the question, but where Arich and Atik meet? Because it just carries over the question to, so Arich and Atik have some dissonance. So he explained there's a level called Chochmas Tima. Chochmas Tima is the super consciousness that is not conscious, but it's also not completely beyond consciousness. So it's super conscious. It serves as the interface. And Chochmas Tima essentially travels between Atik and Arich, because there's two levels in Chochmas Tima. One is one that's concealed from us, but it's not fundamentally beyond. Like you'd say something is hidden, like we talk about the Koiches Nalomim. You sense an idea falls into your head, it comes from somewhere. That somewhere can be accessed, but not directly. And then there's a level of super consciousness that's Sasum Be'etzem. He explained the difference between Mem and Samach, the two levels of Makiv Der Chezud, Makiv Der Yosher. There's a long discussion in volume 1. I'm not going to go through all the details. Suffice it to say, it's two levels of concealment. And those two levels, they interact with each other, and that's where the real interface takes place. So Arich Ampin represents the part of the concealment that already begins to relate Chochma Ma'ayin to Motzah. The Chochma is Ma'ayin. And then there's the higher level of Chochmas Tema that relates more to Atik, as he explains it there at length. He brought a Zoyar. The Zoyar says there that the words Aleph and the word Pella are interchangeable. Aleph and Pella are the same letters. Aleph is Chochma, the letter Aleph. The first letter is the first sphere. We're talking about conscious sphere, Chochma. Chochma Gluya. conscious wisdom, not super conscious. Pella, on the other hand, is wonder. Wonder. It's referring to that wonder within intelligence. That's the superconscious. Chachma has a taste of Pella. That's why Aleph is the same letters as Pella, because when you think of an idea, it's not just the beginning of the cognitive process, it's also a certain sense of wonder. Like we talked about resonance, a sense of a higher truth. Even Riya means a type of like visualization of it. So as we discussed, intelligence is not just intelligence. Intelligence is really the key to experiencing a higher reality than ourselves. Emotions are subjective. So they're about our own needs. Emotions cannot experience transcendence on their own. It's only through a lot of training that we learned about mutfa, murgish, muskel, that the emotions can grow to the point where they can also experience the transcendence of the intellect. But intellect, healthy intellect, is transcendent by nature because it's not about me. It's about the truth of an idea. That's why we study. That's why we use our minds. So the mind is able to dream, imagine, aspire. It is able to understand things that are beyond us. Emotionally, you can say, I'm not there, but intellectually, I can relate to the concept. So essentially, Chachma Aleph opens us up to the Pella, to the wonder of Keser, or namely, Arich. But then he says there's a second interpretation in Zohar. You'll soon see where I'm going with all this. It's all very relevant. The second interpretation in Zohar is that Aleph is Pella. It's not just the letters of Pella in a different order. Aleph and Pella are one. So he explained that there's two levels in how Chachma relates to the wonder. One is it's a keli to it, and it faces it, like we spoke about, remember the Yichud Abba V'Imei Elohim, when Chachma and Bina gaze at the forehead, the metzach of Arich and Atik, which in turn, if you may recall, we learned this earlier here, transforms all the dinim, all the gvuras. So it's all ties together. You'll soon see how it all really comes together. Okay, but that's still, Chachma is gazing at it. So the Aleph is still not Pella, but then there's a joining and a union, because remember, the interface, you want total fusion. So there's the second interpretation in Zohar, he explains, is that the Aleph becomes Pella. They won. That the wonder of Keser, of the superconscious, becomes one with the consciousness of Chachma. And that's the second opinion in Zohar, that Aleph and Pella become one. Okay. Then he continues in Ayin Beis, and in case you want to know the pages, what I'm referring to, I'll tell you exactly what page it's on. This is me a moment. I'm just looking it up because it'd be helpful to see what it says there. Okay. It's page in volume 1. It's chapter 228, and in the original edition, it's page 464. It's quite a while back. Kiasisa Pella, Kiasisa Aleph. Yeah. So now, then he goes and continues a discussion there that what causes Chachma to have this ability to first experience Pella and then to become one with it is because Chachma is bittul, koyach ma. It's the ma of Chachma that has that ability to be that way. So koyach ma, and ma Shem avai b'mili alfin, connected to the Aleph. Ma, remember, is Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. When the Hey is written out, Hey Aleph. So it adds up to 45. All this indicates on bittul. And he begins in chapter 229 there. He says, let's understand what is Shayma. What is it? And he says it's to connect two hafchim, two opposites, And he goes on to a whole thing how Adam is Gematria Ma, and he talks about Toyu and Tikkun. So he introduces that bittul is the key to the interface, because as long as there's no bittul on the lower level, how are you going to interconnect to something that's greater than you are and beyond you? So bittul is the key that opens the door between existence and the transcendent, between existence and the divine, the ultimate interface. Or in the language we just said, between Chachma and Keser, between Aleph and Pella. So then he goes on a long discussion on that. Then he comes to what we're leading now to what we're going to be now reviewing. That this Shema is the domain of Atzilus. Toyu doesn't have this bittul. That's why Toyu is a chaotic world, imbalanced world, incongruous world, clashes to the point of the shattering of the containers, lack of tolerance, the lack of accommodation, I would say, or interconnectivity, scholarless, as he explains at length back in volume 1. Tikkun is the model of balance, the model of harmony, where different forces work with each other. The human body, a healthy human body, is a perfect example of that. Nature is a perfect example of that. Atzilus is the model of perfect balance due to bittul, due to Shema. Shamban, like a behemoth is tramples. A behemoth doesn't have that discipline. And Ma has that, and the Ma of Atzilus, of Adam, brings in that discipline. In the context of what we're talking about now, in a dark world, you need to have Oir and Chesed of Shema that comes to refine it and put it in order. That's Bizman Hazeh. Until the future, once we transform existence, then ultimately we'll see the power within Ban, within Gvura of its own. But we are not there yet. Meanwhile, everything is under the guidance of Oir. Like I discussed the other last week when I gave the overview, that you have to have Oir to illuminate darkness. Chesed has to guide Gvura. Esav is a very powerful force. Gvura is very powerful, but it needs guidance in the world in which we live. Like Hu Yimshal Bach. Because we live in a world where you need to have that direction and guidance. That's where Korach made his mistake. That's where Yitzchak saw in Esav the future of his power, but was not yet ready to be revealed until you now have the chesed of Ma, of Yaakov, that's Mevarer, and refines the Ban of Esav. Okay. So then he goes even further in volume 1, and that's what he's going to cite now. Where does Ma get this power? Because based on that, it seems like it's more powerful than Toyu. Toyu, we know, is higher than Ma, and then Atzilus. Toyu Tikkun, more energy. As a matter of fact, we eat food, we learned earlier. Why? Because the food is rooted, Semeach, Chai, Semeach, and Doim are rooted higher than Adam, than Ma. That's why we're dependent on it, because they bring sparks that are even higher than the sparks in the world of Ma. However, because Ma is the power to Mivar Ban, ultimately, Shema has a root that's even higher than the root of Toyu. So in some ways, this physical world, yes, including an animal, is rooted higher than Adam. But if you really go, the big picture, Adam is rooted higher than Behemoth. That's why the human being has the power to subdue an animal, not the other way around, even though an animal physically is stronger because of our wisdom and ultimately because of our bittul, because you have a neshama. So even though the human being is physically weaker than many animals, but he has the tzelem elikim, the koyach ma of chokhmah that has the ability to touch Pella and all the way high to the highest levels. So then comes a piece where he explains this in at more length in Kabbalistic terminology. Where is the root of the Shema? So he calls it the Shema that comes, he calls Shema HaChodosh, the new Shema that comes from the Metzach of Adam Kadmon. Ban, he says, is rooted in the Havolim of Adam Kadmon. I'll explain what that means in a moment. In the cavities. So if Adam Kadmon is considered the primordial man, meaning the archetype of what the human organism is like, Adam Kadmon, primordial. So just like physically we see a human body has different parts and different faculties, we also see in Atzilus different parts and different faculties on a spiritual level. But Adam Kadmon is the original man, so to speak, the original structure, So, and this is important to make sure that we mafshit megash miusan, that we're not thinking of it in physical terms. So please understand we're talking in ethereal and metaphorical terms, that just like we have eyes and ears and a nose, so too we have the concept of oizen chaytem peh, ear, chaytem the nose and mouth of Adam Kadmon. But we also have a metzach of Adam Kadmon. So when you look at the human body, you see the following. There are only 7 ventricles, cavities, that open up the outer body to the inner. Those are the 2 nostrils, the 2 ears, and the mouth. The forehead, even though within the forehead lies and within the skull lie a brain, but there's no opening. The cavities are only the nostrils, the mouth, and the ears. Together, they're 7. 2 ears, 2 nostrils is 2, 4. What's the 7th? The mouth is 1. And the eyes, sorry. And the 2 eyes, that's 7. That's why we say, Sheftim v'sheitim titl lecha b'chol sharecha. You should appoint judges and police over all your gates. So the Taich says, what are the gates? The gates in a human being are these 7 gates that open us up. Like a city needs gates, and you need gatekeepers to make sure that what goes into your eyes, into your ears, into your nose, into your mouth, and what comes out of it should be protected. But that's an aside. But here the focus is on the 3, which is not the 7, which is the 2 nostrils, the 2 ears, and the mouth. And that's called Oizen Chaytem Peh. So he says Shamban is rooted in the Oizen Chaytem Peh, and he specifically talks mostly about the Peh, Dibur. It's like Dibur. So when you speak, on one hand, it's coming out. On the other hand, it's not expressing everything within you, but it's also expressing your passion, and you can express a lot of deep feelings with speech. But then there's another energy, and that's Shayma, that comes on one hand, it's less revealed, but on the other hand, it comes from a deeper place in Ak called Metzach, the forehead of Ak. So you may recall back on, I'll give you the page, when he began discussing this topic, he said the following. I'm referring to the page of Metzach. So this is coming page 1237 and on. So he said the forehead has in it a paradox. On one hand, everything is concealed. You can't see the brain, but there's a glow that you can see on Chachmas Adam Teir Panov. You see an atzmizdika glow that you can only see in a wise person. You see a certain aura and a certain shine and glow on their face. That glow is coming from a very profound, what he calls atzmizdika place. So Metzach, I believe he said this very explicitly on page, I'm just looking what page it was there. We spoke about the Metzach, the forehead, that it has both things. On one hand, it's Megala, the Etzem. On the other hand, the Gilui is in a state that you can't really fully see. An example he gives is like a barrel that's a barrel of wine, where the wine is literally bursting at the seams. That's the expression he explains. And you see beads of wine outside of the barrel. The bead looks like just a little bead of wine, but the truth is, it's expressing the intensity of all the wine within the barrel. So the mind within the brain, within the metzach, within the forehead, is like the wine. And the glow on the face, on the forehead, is what he called the beads. So it's not like speech reveals a lot more. You hear a person speak, you know what they're saying, they express, but it doesn't have the intensity. Even the deepest part of speech that expresses the deepest feelings still does not have the amount that you could see when you say, that a person, that you should see the face of your teacher. And when you see the face of your teacher, it adds in your understanding. Why? Because there's something about the glow that reflects from the deepest parts of the etzem of the teacher. That's the metzach. I'm just looking at what page he used that. He explained metzach in that way.
I think it begins on 1237.
I just said 1237, but does he say? Yeah, I mentioned 1237, but 1237. Also this point. Let me see. Let me go down below. Shametzach master ala moichin shebereish umayla mesim. Yeah, it conceals. Then there's the second half. Let me see. Yeah, that he says there. But then later he brings that the Metzach, on the other hand, maybe the next page. Yeah. Okay, look there, you'll see the idea. So now he's introducing this point back to us that he brought there. And just for and this is elaborated in the Maimer Chukas HaTeira HaGimel that we're going to now refer to. I'll read inside. I see it's very late, but we'll read inside, which goes back to volume 1, page 536 and on, where he discusses this at length, why Shayma has such a power, because on one hand, even though it's technically lower than Ban in Gilui, but it has an atzmizdika power of bittul that allows Chochmah, Pella Aleph to connect to Pella, and ultimately create the full interface that Maz Mevarer Ban, the union of Chesed and Gvura, where Chesed is Mevarer Gvura and is able to transform it. And that's what he's going to be explaining now. So let me read inside. But this was the introduction, important. So really what we're talking about here yet is another way of understanding the interface, that the bottom line is, when you talk about Atzmus, meaning the Eibishter himself, doesn't have all these different limitations. But when you talk about Tachtenim, people in our level, creation, here we can't reach the Esem just like that. We live much more in a world of gradation and a process, step by step, like stepping stones. That's why we need a Seder Shtalshlus. That's why we can't jump to transformation. We have to first start with education, like we learn Mutva, Murgesh, Muskel. We train ourselves and we grow from subjectivity to objectivity, ultimately to total transcendence. So because of that, we need to understand their stages here. So one of the ways Kabbalah explains and Chassidus elaborates and gives it the Chabad language of Chabad that we can understand it, is that there's atzmizdika experiences, and atzmizdika experience like Yom Kippur. There's something that happens in Yom Kippur that is not even in our control. That the Etzem HaNeshama, the Yechida, is revealed. Now, a person could do avodah and become more a keli and a container and a vessel to it, but still, there's a certain atzmizdika experience. It's like something happens and there's a flash. On the other hand, we know that we need avodah mamata lamaila. We have to go step by step by step. You can't just rely on moments of grace. That's why most of the year is not Yom Kippur. It's not Simchas Torah. V'Yaakov hol chadaka, we go back to our lives, our mundane lives. Like he said, mamata lamaila, step by step by step. And the end, we want to have a joining of both. We want to have an atzmizdika experience, but in a giluyim dika level, in giluyim meaning integrated. So yes, it would be great to say you learn something by your teacher and get everything, you'll get the etzem of what he's saying, but it doesn't work that way. Until 40 years later, you don't really appreciate Adaita the Rabbi, you don't come to the etzem deya, because that's life. Ben Chumash Lemikra, you start 5 years old, you learn Chumash. Verse, Ben Eser Lemishnah, 10 years old, you learn Mishnah. 15 years old, you learn Talmud, Gemara. And as you grow, and your mind expands, and your containers expand, Mamata Lamaila, step by step, with time to time, you have a Gili Atzmi, but it's not necessarily integrate. Slowly you integrate, and you come to a point where you can receive the greatest levels, even of the Etzem itself. So we constantly need both. So the Metzach that Shema comes from reflects an atzmizdik experience, which is experienced through bittul. And ban is experienced much more through the giluyim of dibur, like we said. But you need to have the bittul of ma to ultimately refine ban. And we do that step by step until we first sweeten the gvura, like in level number 1. You subdue it, you train the animal soul, you educate it. Level 2, you fully transform it, but it's a gili mamayla lamata, completely atzmizdik gili, like Shema from the metzach, from the forehead. And then comes the point where the cheshach itself, the gvura itself, can reveal its atzmizdik power, where it itself is transformed to light. But that can only come after the earlier stages. So this next paragraph is going to discuss this Or Elyon that comes from Shema. So I'll read a few lines because we're already 10:30. So, Ubir Sheresh Inyan. And to explain the root of the Inyan of this power of Shema, that's Mavar Shamban, which we said, like by Matan Torah, is Agili Atzmi, where the Or is so powerful, it just transforms the Cheshech Mamela automatically from the top down. He says, to explain the root of this power, now it was explained earlier, and here he now goes back to everything I just summed up. The third chukas hatera, the third discourse with the beginning chukas hatera, and the discourses that follow it, back in volume 1, like he says, page 536. What do we learn there? We're talking about the Shema. Where is it rooted? It's coming from the metzach, the forehead of Adam Kadmon. Shazel al derech mashal, that's like, for an example, kamoi b'ha'aras ponim v'hametzach, that when the glowing face and the forehead, meir b'chinas primis v'atzmas hanefesh, that when you see the glow of the face and of the forehead, and that is radiating the inner and core of the nefesh. You may not understand it, but you just see a glow. We saw it on the Rebbe and Rosh Hashanah many times. You saw the glow. You see it generally in a wise person. Chachmas Adam Teir Panov. Rakshazeu, but the thing is, it's al yedei hefsikum metzach va'aponim. You're not seeing the core source of the glow. You're just seeing the glow. It's coming through the hefsik, through the partition or through the separation of the forehead and the face. In other words, if you were able to open up the forehead, you'd see the very source of this luminous energy. But now we're seeing it like so-called like a reflection of it. Doesn't call it a reflection, but it's like you're only seeing the outer expression of it in the glow. Like the glow of a face is an interesting concept. What are you exactly seeing when you see a face glowing? On one hand, you see a glow. So you know there's something there, and you can't quite put your finger on it. So he said, this is the message. If you remember 2 pages back, he said, when they see the glowing face of the king, when you see the glowing face of the king, what you see is that even the prosecutor, when he sees that, gets transformed to become the defense, because the very glow. So this is essentially referring to that level. What was that? He called that chesed of atik, chesed kshet. So ukamoy came, again, I'll read a few lines just to get us into the topic. Next page, 1324. Kamoy kain Shema, like this example of the glowing face, that's like Shema, zeu mebchinas atzmus ein sof. Shema is coming from atzmus ein sof. Like the glow, that Shema comes from the forehead of Ak, like the glow that comes, so it's the forehead is only the outer expression of it, but it's rooted in the atzmus ein sof, bechinas ab the Ak. The name Ab. Remember, there's Shema, Ban, Sag. Ban is rooted in Sag. In 63, there are the 4 permutations. Ab, Ayin Beis, is the highest one. The Mili Yudin is the highest level. And that's where Ma, of Tikkun, of Atzilus, is rooted, coming from the Metzach of Ak, which was what? The Etzem of Atzmus Ein Sof, the level of Ab, of Ak, which is the highest level of the 4 names, or the 4 gematria, you could say the four forms of how we spell out Yud Kei Vav Kei. Rakshaba b'derech b'kiyah, like he explains there, but it comes in the form of piercing through. You don't see the full glory of the source. It's like piercing through, like he explained there, the beads of wine that pierce through the barrel. Here, the power is so intense that it's shining through. The forehead is like the outer glow of something extremely powerful within. The Hainu Shemisalam Ha'ir, because at the end of the day, the forehead conceals, it doesn't reveal. On one hand, you see the glow is coming from an asmisdika place, but it's not something we can contain. So it's fundamentally in a way that the Oyer is being concealed, but not concealed like a tzimtzum, concealed simply that its expression is only in the glow of the forehead. like he says, "Ve'ein zeh ha'ora levad." This is not just a reflection. Like a reflection would be the light is shining, and then there's a reflection of the light that you see. Here, the metzach is carrying the entire intensity, but you only see the outer form of it. So he says, not just a reflect, kima etzem shemisalim. It's the etzem that's concealed. So the etzem is there. The teacher's etzem is shining on the forehead. In his speech, you're hearing his ideas, his passion, and it reveals a lot of him, but not his etzem, not as deep as the etzem of the metzach. In the words, it's more revealed in a way you can understand. In the metzach, it's just something you see, some atzmizdik force that you see the glow. Like just like when you look at someone you love and they're glowing in love, there's no words. It's just a glow, an aura. So kim etzem shemisalim kamoishu be'etzem is the etzem that's concealed, but it stays the etzem exactly as is an etzem. It was not diminished. It's just that we're only seeing the outer dimension of it. Yi'u and Shem. Delve into what it says there, which is interesting. He doesn't use this very often. It means we should go look there, which I did, just for the record, and that's why I elaborated, because I see the Rebbe Rashab, right? Yi'u Sham means don't just read it, but delve into it deeply. And when you look there, you'll see he explains all of what I said before, the introduction to help us understand this. I'm going to stop here because he's going to develop this a bit further. Then he's going to come back and say that this is the Shayma that has the power to just come, like by Matan Torah, and transform, because it's an atzmizdik power. But it's not a power that transforms from within, it transforms from without. In other words, it's a gilim al-maila lamata that just has the power to transform. It's not an internal. We're going to learn about the internal coming from within in the next page when he finishes this last paragraph. So on page 1325, in the middle, he's going to go to the Amtoka Gimel. But we got to be patient because to understand that well, we need to understand this well. So I'll stop here. I'll take any questions.
What triggers this level of Hamtaka? Is it bittul? I mean, is it obviously it's about a bittul, but is there any more specificity that would trigger this level of sweetening or birur, if you will?
You mean from our end or from above?
Exactly. Well, from our end, it's not just 10. I mean, you said, for example would be Yom Kippur, but on
well, he gave example. Matan Torah. It happened by Matan Torah. It happened by the Beis Hamikdash, by Shlomo Melech. There are times in history that it happens. There are times in the year it happens. The avodah of it, I would wait to see how he finishes the subject. The avodah, what he said before was that there comes a time like the Tzaddik Gomer, whose deep, passionate love, Ava b'tainugim, is so powerful that it just spills over. In chapter 9 in Tanya, he explains the dynamics of it, that it ultimately, and it transforms the animal soul. If you're asking in our work, everything relative again. You have to find in your something, there's where we get more engaged with the animal soul, and there are times where we just have such a surge of love and connection that at that moment, at least, everything is completely transformed to godliness, temporarily at least. I mean, if you're talking about applying it, but I will apply it as we go along. Right now I would stay away from that personally, but if you wanted some examples, those were some examples.
Thank you.
And he also said about bringing a carbon. When you bring a carbon, when you sanctify something, so you're bringing in a higher energy. When a person does a mitzvah even, they're bringing the godly energy and it's transforming the material object. You're not asking the parchment whether it wants to cooperate. You're turning the parchment into something. Every mitzvah you do is in a way of doing that. I don't say the word imposing, but you're drawing the energy into whatever the mitzvah you're doing. That's on a very basic level. Yeah. The bittul, of course, is vital. We'll learn about the bittul as we continue here. He's going to talk about this now more in this paragraph of how this works exactly. Yeah. Just want to say a general statement. Everything here follows what we've learned. Remember, it's growth. It's all about growth. It's about taking where you are and moving the needle forward. Whether a person is impulsive, reflexive, mutva, you want to move it to a little more deliberate emotions that are more cognitive based. It's all about bringing more godliness into it and less your own selfish and self-interested and egocentric inclinations. That's the process. If you want it to be very personal, you have to go look at yourself. Where do you stand with your ego, with your own fears and insecurities and all your blockages, and how you grow through that. If you want to implement this, that's where you need to take this. I am specifically avoiding going there right now because that's very personal, each person in their own way. Here we're learning the subject matter, the formula. But at the end of the day, as I say many, many times, it comes down to personalizing, finding in your life these levels of growth. And you have to not deceive yourself into thinking you're on the highest level. You have to begin where you're at and slowly move it as much as you can. If you can translate that every day in Shema in a personal way, you're good, you're on your way. Okay, so we're stopping here at the top of page 1324. Any other questions?